Howdy, howdy. Welcome back to my tiny corner of the internet. And so I was pleasantly surprised to see the positive feedback on the last video. I didn't expect that to take off as much as it did. I'm very thankful for all the likes, and I enjoy the interaction. I like that people come onto my comment section and for the most part leave well thought out comments and treat it like a discussion. It's because I've always treated my channel more like a discussion board, where I put my 2 cents on the channel, and then people come in and tell me what they think, and then we have a discussion. That if you probably noticed is that for the vast majority of comments in my own comment section, I tend to respond to those comments provided that they are a good faith comment on my channel. And so, it's been an enjoyable thing. I enjoy the ideas that people are bringing to the table, and overall, it's treating it more like a discussion. As you can probably tell, I'm not really one of those kinds of people or even content creators that's looking to set up a one-way parasocial relationship with his audience, is because the fact is, I'm kind of a yapper. I like to talk. I like to talk to people. I like to exchange ideas, and it's nice to see that people are coming into my comment section and engaging with the ideas, because that's the thing that I like the most, okay? It's not just a one-way political figure where I'm just telling you what you have to think, and, if you disagree with me, you're obviously against me, yada, 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 right? I'm very much the kind of person that's like, if you've got good ideas, I'll engage with those ideas, no matter what side of the political spectrum you really are on. With that being said, to all the new subscribers, is because 150 new subs after a single video, that's never really happened on my channel. And so, welcome to my tiny corner of the internet. And I hope you enjoy your stay, and I hope you enjoy the discussions. All right, so in today's video, I want to discuss potentially why, in the end, young men will end up leaving the right. And it has to do with a couple of reasons that, ironically enough, that the Democrats and the political left doesn't want to admit. So if you're familiar with, the nature of why young men pivoted from the left over the last 10 years, I'll tell you why, okay? Because I am a late millennial, and I grew up in the era where feminism was this, popular culture that was almost abrasive, and there was just kind of this hanging, culture that just seemed to hate everything that was a man, okay? You couldn't go 2 seconds without, like, something being labeled as rape culture. I was there when the atheism split between Atheism Plus and, regular atheism, with the Amazing Atheist, Thunderfoot, when that feminist was trying to get him fired from his university job in 2014. And I watched a lot of Sargon of Akkad, and I remember the popular culture being feminist, and I would argue that cancel culture was much more pertinent back then than it is now. I think the woke is dead. I think by and large the woke is dead, and it's never coming back. But, cancel culture back in the mid-2010s was a very real thing. And, if you ask anybody who was a Republican before Donald Trump, a lot of the Republican figures, always cowered before, the left-wing media, the liberal media, CNN, you had BuzzFeed, you had all these different journal outlets that, if you said even anything remotely misogynistic, you would be basically smeared and dragged through the mud. Okay? That was real cancel culture then. And so there was just this common culture of hatred if you were just an ordinary guy, and you felt it. You felt like that you were hated just for existing, while at the same time, told that you were privileged just for existing. And so if you were a guy who grew up in a rather unfortunate background, this was kind of insult to injury, being called privileged over something that you don't have. You're just like, what privilege do I really have if you're poor? And to a degree, it carries even further now, is because the average person can't even afford their own home. So, that combination with that culture, that cultural remnant, it's, again, insult to injury. With that being said, I watched that cultural turn from, SJW progressive feminism, transition to what we have, like, just, almost downright, everybody makes fun of feminism nowadays. It's a laughingstock. It's a shadow of its former self. There's even stereotypes about male feminists. And I remember when those kind of stereotypes started getting set up by Jordan Peterson. And so, I watched the political shift that was going on from the political left to the political right over the last 10 years to what we have now. And so the interesting thing is, I also got to see what rhetoric the political right used to undercut the political left. And I've also noticed how the right, even though it's captured that thunder of, young male anger at the establishment and also against, like, the political left, is that they're once again fumbling it too in their own particular ways, because they're just incapable of addressing the root problems that, if you're a young guy, you're probably dealing with right now. Okay, the truth of the matter is, if you're an average guy working an average job, okay, your job does not pay you enough to afford a house off of a single income, and on top of that, you feel like you're being outsized by older men who are quite literally established financially, in the sense that you can live, you know, what the classical hallmarks of manhood really are, i.e. being able to own a home, have a wife, settle down, have a family, own a car, you know, to make your mark upon society and call something that is truly yours. If you're the average man, you're probably renting. Because I know that for a fact, is because I own a house, and I would have never been able to own a house if it weren't for the fact that my wife works as well. So it was all entirely by chance that I had a partner that was also working, is because you also got to recognize that, you know, there's a common traditionalist culture that almost hates dual income no kids. You know, and the reason why I personally don't want to have kids is because if you looked at the cost of living, if you looked at the average house price, I'm house poor. You know, the last thing I want to do is add additional stress to where, like, not only am I house poor, I'm going to be even poorer if you bring kids into the picture. That's terrible. But, you know, neither here nor there. So in the 2010s, you had this constant man-hating culture where everything was rape culture, and you had Title IX, you know, there was this common talking point, you know, I remember where there was a story where a feminist accused a disabled man in a wheelchair of sexual harassment and raping her, you know, for just merely existing. And the interesting thing, if you haven't noticed, that a lot of people play these particular games is that, and I'm going to say the quiet part out loud, is that if you're particularly ugly, people engage in psychopathological and psychosexual politics to justify why you're kind of less than human. And what I mean by that is that people make an entire judgment of your characters just because they don't find you appealing. And it's not something exclusively women do, okay? A lot of the incels and black pillars will tell you that it's only women that really, you know, do a post hoc rationalization of hating somebody's character because they're ugly. Men do it too. You see it all the dang time. You know, if a woman's ugly and, you know, she mouths off about men, yeah, of course, like, she's going to get dogpiled. You're going to see a bunch of hateful comments. Both sides do kind of psychosexual, you know, post hoc rationalizations over the fact that they just don't find them attractive. They find them ugly. Okay, and so this was going on. So he gets Title IX. He gets suspended from school for like a whole year, even though by all reason and merit, he never raped her. It doesn't even look like it could have even been possible, because he's a cripple. But nonetheless, that was the story that they ran with. And this was probably in the late 2010s, okay? And so that culture existed, and it seemed like there was this hanging culture that everything you did as a man was just almost like a sin. It was almost criminal, in a sense, even though you were just a guy who was just trying to live his life and just be left alone and do your own thing, okay? And to be fair, okay, and most people who consider themselves on the political right, if you think the right is your ticket to escape from that kind of like hating culture, that's actually why I'm making this video, is because it's really not. Because prior to Donald Trump, I mean, I was an early Donald Trump supporter, and I still remember when, you know, what was happening was that, like, if you were a Donald Trump supporter, and the Ted Cruz fans would go on about basically saying that most people who supported Donald Trump in the primaries were just basement-dwelling losers who just watched anime. You know, that was the stereotype. And I hate to be honest, but, like, you know, there's a good amount of people who watch anime that supported Donald Trump because of that meme. You know, there was all memes going about how Donald Trump is going to make anime real. Obviously, you know, obviously mean, but, you know, that's kind of the thing. Is that, like, you know, there is a large swath of young men who do not care about the performative masculinity that the political right wants to basically have men follow. They just want to enjoy their video games and be left alone. And I wasn't really so much in that camp because I don't really play a whole lot of video games myself. But that's a large swath of people who are irritated at the political left, is because back in 10 years ago, you know, everything was rape culture. Everything was misogynistic. You know, I remember Anita Sarkeesian making a multi-million-dollar funded video on YouTube talking about Batman's, you know, some kind of, you know, some woman's ass on a video game. And so the thing is that you had this sorts of like antagonist culture. The male gaze was bad, but the female gaze on, you know, sexualizing particular men was okay. It was the double standard that pissed people off, especially within the gamer community. Now, here's kind of the interesting thing that I've noticed that people on the right are starting to realize, is that the right doesn't care about ordinary men either. And I'm going to tell you why. This is why I'm making this video, because I wanted to give my 2 cents on this one, is because a lot of young men who might have cozied up to the right is because they got tired of the political left, you know, playing, you know, these games of censorship to shut down, you know, media that they didn't enjoy. The right will do it too, is because you have an interesting combination, is that you'll find out that feminists, there's a particular combination between feminists and right-wing conservative girl dads that hate almost anything that men do. And, you know, there are pretty powerful alliance. It's funny, is they'll say that they're different. If you ask them individually on their issues, if you ask, like, you know, the average liberal feminist what they think, you know, they'll give you probably a list of reasons of why they're liberal progressives, and you ask the conservative girl dad, you know, they're probably going to be their own particular aisle, and, you know, they're going to give you a bunch of right-wing answers. But when it comes to gender issues, they're going to almost one by one line up, okay? And so you might have noticed it is because Fox News did several hit pieces between, having men, these stereotypically rugged masculine men that, probably drive Ford F-150s, and they got their beards out, they probably got their receded hairlines, to bitch about men playing video games when they could be working 80 hours a work week or digging ditches, breaking their backs, and probably, why aren't they, destroying their bodies where they're completely crippled by the time they're 45. Okay, a lot of young men are starting to realize that, and you're realizing that really no side really cares about ordinary men. Okay, and I want to give you a little bit of context about that. And I've said this a lot on my channel before, is that neither side really cares about it. I've said this before. I made one of the earliest videos on my channel was talking about like why I don't think red pill ideology is, and I figured that like left-wingers would have adopted that, but they never really did. So let's go through the anthology of how this political swap happened. Over the 2010s, it felt like there was just this absolute hatred for anything that was male, okay? The political right noticed this schism and, recognized that men were getting tired of being antagonized and penalized just for being men. The political right rewrote the narrative and tried to reframe it as men wanting to return back to traditional masculinity. And this was a very powerful option because most men, see masculinity, think that's inherently me. And so therefore, the right must be my champion. And so therefore I'm going to follow for it, right? But young men are also kind of recognizing that, this terms and conditions of what it means to be masculine and a man, according to the political right, is doing, 80 hours of hard labor, destroying your body by the time you're 45, not having even an ounce of joys because men are supposed to forsake any ounce of joy in this world to basically be entirely selfless, utilitarian machines, for society. And they're realizing that the right doesn't like them either, because the right wants to set up a hollow, personalized, performative sense of masculinity where, you're just nothing more than a utilitarian machine for society, and that's all your goal is. And as soon as you're no longer able to provide for society, then you're no longer worth a damn. In fact, you're seen as lesser than a man, okay? And so the fact is, if you have an ounce of joy, if you have any ounce of fun, if you have any ounce of just being, I want to be left alone and play my video games and just, have a quiet life, you're going to get an amount of vitriolic hatred from the right, is because the fact is they're seeing you as not performatively being a man. And so that's the thing. Neither does the right care about it. And that's kind of the funny part, is because I've been on the political left for the last 3 years, and I have spent many years talking to the political left because they lost, young men's vote. They lost young men's appeal. They don't really care. And the one thing I noticed the political left tried to pivot to is, once again, to this hollow notion of performative masculinity that most men who just want to live their lives and just have an okay standard of living quite literally don't give a fuck about. And neither do I, as, I'm in my early 30s, but the thing is I didn't give a shit about this stuff when I was in my 20s either, and Gen Z probably doesn't as well. They just want to be left alone so they can enjoy their lives and have an okay standard of living, provided that they work hard. Okay? And so the left, if you didn't pay attention to the Kamala Harris campaign, is they tried to run an ad where they're like, we need to win back young men, and we're going to bring back a bunch of, deep-voiced, bearded, men who drive Ford F-150s and oversized pickup trucks, and, it's going to be just like what the right wants young men to do, but except we're going to do it for women. I'm a rugged man who's doing this all, doing that 80 hours of, work week and, digging ditches and destroying my body, but this time it's for women, and that's kind of the interesting thing. Of course, as usual, that video got dislike bumped. I spent many years talking to the political left saying that, okay, if you're a socialist, okay, and your entire shtick is, and you want to win over young men, is that, you believe that we should make a more equitable society, a fairer society, a more compassionate and empathetic society, where we take care of one another, well, when we're not always strong. You're going to have to contend with the culture that young men are instilled with since the day that they were children, is that, that young men are expected to be stoic, manage everything by themselves and not ask for help. Because if you ask for help, you're considered lesser of a man. You're considered less than a man is because you didn't solve the issue on yourself. Is because society, by and large, relies on men to fix society. And I'm not saying that's not a bad thing. I think everybody should try to make society better if they possibly can. I think they should be responsible adults. I think that people should be stoic to some sense, is because the fact is it's better to rule your emotions than be ruled by your emotions. But that's neither here nor there. It's that double standard, almost kind of cold contempt that young men hate, that they feel as if they're nothing more than utilitarian machines to be discarded once they're no longer useful to society. That's what I'm critiquing in this video. And so the thing is with the political left is that they're just trying to do the same thing, but they're just going to add on another utility saying like, yeah, no, we're doing all this rugged performative masculinity, but this time it's for women. And of course, it got dislike bombed, is because it didn't settle well with young men. Young men, and I'm going to say this again, including myself, would like to live an okay standard of living provided we work hard, and we just want to be left alone. That's all we want. You know, we're like most men don't want to be treated like women. We don't want to be seen like women. We don't want the same situation as women. You know, we just want to not be seen as these, you know, utilitarian machines to be discarded upon as soon as we don't perform that masculinity. You know, okay, that's it. It's that simple. But if you look at the political right, you know, if you look at the performative masculinity that they want, I call it the gay masculinity LARP, is because the fact is, in an ironic sense, right? You know, being a man was being your own person and not caring what other people thought about who you were. But then if you look at performative masculinity in a twisted sense of irony, and why I call it the gay masculinity LARP, is because they're buying these oversized pickup trucks. You know, they're growing out their beards, they're wearing these hats, they're wearing these shades, they're wearing all, you know, they're buying Black Rifle coffee, all in a sense to show that they're men. And the reason why they drive like pricks on the road trying to domineer everything is because the fact is, it's, you know, they want to prove how much of a man they really are. In an ironic sort of sense, they're almost seeking the validation of society to show that they're a man, which is the least masculine thing to do on the face of the planet. I thought being a man was not giving a fuck what other people thought of you. But in a twisted sort of sense of irony, the gay masculinity LARP is all about, you know, how you can convince society that you're the man, you're the real man, by growing out your beard, by buying oversized pickup trucks, by being loud, obnoxious, you know, all those sorts of things. It's all a performance, okay? And so that's the crux of the video. That's why I think the political right is going to lose young men in the end. That's my hot take. And you might have said at the beginning of the video, Alistair, you're crazy, you're a smart guy, but, you know, that's never going to happen. Nobody is going to, you know, support the left and, you know, how they want to turn men transgender or some nonsense. No, I'm not trying to make that argument. I don't really care. And I'm saying this as somebody who was a progressive myself for many years. Even when I was a right-wing libertarian, I didn't care about these groups. I don't have any ill will against them. You know, I just wanted to live my life and be left alone. And that's why I was a right-wing libertarian for a good period of time. And even when I did watch Sargon of Akkad, I didn't really have negative opinions of these groups. I just wanted them to mind their own business and not try and force their ideology upon everybody. But this is why I think young men are going to abandon the political right, is because they're going to get sick and tired of these kinds of men cannibalizing them when they don't care about their performative masculinity. They don't care about having 150K oversized pickup trucks, you know, to pretend that they're country. They don't care about growing out their beards. They might grow their beards just because, you know, sometimes people look better with beards. I personally don't look good with a beard. And my girlfriend would probably kill me. But, you know, that's kind of the thing, is that, like, you know, they're going to get sick and tired of the performative nonsense. They're going to get tired of the antagonistic culture that the political right puts upon young men, seeing them as nothing but more than utilitarian, disposable production machines to be thrown away once they're 45 and they've, you know, destroyed their entire body working, you know, blue-collar labor their entire lives. They're going to get sick and tired of the culture that values them purely because they're a utility more than anything. You know, I see the writing on the wall. I saw a Twitter post go viral. I couldn't find it again recently because for whatever reason, but my friend said, I talked to my friend who is very much on the right-wing train of, like, you know, the right wing cares about men more than the left does. And he comes out of the blue. He's a good guy and all that sort of stuff. Comes out of the blue and brings up this Twitter post that a guy was getting dogpiled. He's like, oh, you enjoy video games and anime? You enjoy these things, these, you know, niche things that, you know, that might bring a little bit of comfort and joy in your life when you can't afford the average house and, you know, you're being antagonized by the right-wing media the entire time? Well, you know, men are not allowed to enjoy things. If you're not, you know, doing 80 hours of back-breaking ditch work or doing some blue-collar trade or just working in construction or doing something stereotypically masculine or going into debt for an oversized pickup truck, you know, you're not being a real man. Real men do X, Y, and Z, you know, and it's just some utilitarian notion that the political right wants to impose upon young men, you know, when they just want to live their lives and just be left alone. Remember, I've said this before. The reason why young men got tired of the political left is because when they were shoving down all this feminist crap down their throats, calling everything under the sun misogynistic and rape culture, you know, trying to censor video games is because, you know, they wanted to censor the male gays, but they didn't want to censor the female gays. You know, that alienated a huge swath of gamers and young men, said, you know what? Fuck you. We don't like your side of the aisle. We're going to the other side. But in the end, I said earlier, is that there's a common pact between the liberal feminist and the conservative girl dad, where on anything, when it comes to anything related to gendered issues, you know, they might disagree on everything else, but when it comes to gender issues, you know, they basically almost have a blood pact. One for one, they agree with everything that they each other say. Okay, but this time with the, you know, right-wing girl dad conservative, you know, who's always antagonizing men for any slight joy in the world that they might have in this godforsaken economy, you know, the right-wing media is going to smear. Like I said, I think it was Laura Ingraham and Fox News did an entire broadcast complaining about why are young men playing video games? They need to be doing blue-collar, hard, back-breaking work, you know, out in the ditches. And this is the thing. The one thing I've noticed, and I've noticed this on the people that I watch on my YouTube channel, I've watched a couple of people who are not really left nor right, but the thing is, any of the cost of living crisis content creators, you know, a couple of people that I follow, and they've talked about this culture. They can't stand it. They're tired of being antagonized by right-wing culture who's always dangling their masculinity over the head, saying that we're not going to consider you a real man unless you do X, Y, and Z, okay? And they're getting sick of it, because at the end of the day, young men just want to be able to afford their own home. They want to be able to have enough money to raise a family, own a car, and live the stereotypical American dream, and at the end of the day, be left alone. Okay? That's what it comes down to, and that's what the political right is fumbling. This is why I think people are gonna, young men particularly, are gonna abandon the political right, is because they're gonna get tired of having their masculinity dangled over their head and gatekept, that if they don't follow this stupid gay masculinity LARP, do this HSB LARP, buy oversized pickup trucks, then they're not considered a real man. Which is funny enough, and I didn't say this earlier in the video, is that's exactly what the feminists did 10 years ago. You know, if you criticize feminism, you had your manhood attacked. And that was a very cheap undertactic that they tried for a good period of time. And, you know, the right wing got very clever about that and recognized that they could just basically emasculate the stereotype of the male feminist. And that would be an excellent counter propaganda. And it worked to a large degree. But if you look at the right wing propaganda and how I could say the right categorically does not care about men. If you remember what feminists were saying about men, you know, 10 years ago, you know, where they said, you know, there was this male hatred. There was even an Australian feminist that's celebrating about not feeding her male baby, okay? Notice how the narrative changed from caring about men to saying that the left doesn't hate men, it doesn't hate males, but the left hates masculinity, and the political right reframed the entire narrative. The right told you the entire time that they don't care about men, they care about the performative masculinity that is utilitarian to society. Now, am I going to make a crusade against masculinity, which I've been accused of doing that, especially in my older videos when I criticized the Red Pill? No, I think every man should be free to live his life on his own terms without having to be cudgeled into any position by the rest of society. I want you to live life on your own terms, comfortably on what you think is best for yourself and what you can do to be the best person to help yourself and society and your family. That is what I think, okay? And whatever way you want to express yourself, because at the end of the day, I'm probably more leaning onto the progressive side of the law, as long as you're not hurting people. I'm okay with your existence. I don't care what you do with yourself. You might be mildly cringy, but I couldn't care less. But, you know, that's the thing. You're free to live your life on your own terms. And honestly, I think that's the most masculine virtue of all, is because the fact is not caring what society thinks of what kind of man you should be is the most masculine virtue of all. So live your life on your own terms. Stop caring what other people think. But that's ultimately why I think people are going to leave the political right, especially young men. And consider it a wager in a sort of sense, because I like to make bets on my own channels, because I'm not afraid of being wrong. You want to prove me wrong? Hold me to it and come back into the comment section year from down the line. Now, does that mean the young men are going to embrace the political left with like open arms? Fuck no. I watched that go downhill with feminism antagonize what it meant to just be an ordinary guy 10 years ago, and I don't expect the political left or them to embrace the political left with open arms. But then again, this video is just my 2 cents, me dropping my opinion on the internet. What do you think? Would you think young men are going to abandon the political right, or do you think they're going to go even further right? Because I've seen that comment on my channel too, and I can't necessarily contend with that, is because I can to a degree understand that, because, you know, the Donald Trump administration is not doing the things that, you know, a lot of young men want. But let me know what you think in the comments. If you like this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And that's just my 2 cents. So hope to see you in the next video. Take it easy.